Control your noise or I will, the flight attendant hissed, yanking a black CEO's arm while his baby cried in terror. Passengers froze as the child was slammed against the armrest. But what none of them knew was that this father wasn't just a passenger. He was a man with the power to bring the entire plane and its crew to their knees. The wheels of Elias Corrin's polished black Oxfords tapped softly against the jet bridge floor as he stepped into the cabin of Lumair Airlines Flight 728. In his arms, his infant son, Micah, nestled snugly against his chest, wrapped in a navy blue knit carrier. The child's breath rose and fell against his father's chest, a soft rhythm that gave Elias both comfort and weight. He adjusted the strap across his shoulder, securing the bag with the essentials, diapers, bottles, a tiny stuffed elephant, and took his first step into the narrow aisle. He didn't expect applause, but the stillness of the cabin struck him oddly. Quiet, almost too quiet. No welcoming smile from the crew, no casual offer to help a man boarding with an infant. Instead, there was a shift in the atmosphere, subtle but immediate, like the faint scent of ozone before a storm. Elias was used to scrutiny. As the CEO of Brighthaven Technologies, one of the fastest rising software firms in the country, he had grown used to walking into rooms where people weren't sure what to make of a tall black man in a custom-tailored navy blazer and polished cufflinks. But this was different. He wasn't in a boardroom. He was just a father trying to get home. He offered a polite nod to a few passengers as he passed, but most avoided eye contact. A white man in business casual moved his laptop case hastily off the aisle. A teenage boy in headphones looked up briefly, then looked away, but Elias's attention settled on a figure near the rear galley, a flight attendant with slick-back blonde hair and a narrow build, who stood with his arms crossed, his eyes following Elias like a hawk. "Excuse me," Elias said, his voice calm, and even as he reached his assigned row, 12B. "Could I get a hand stowing the diaper bag?" The flight attendant didn't move. He just stared. Elias offered a smile, professional but firm. "It's a bit tight trying to hold the baby and reach up at the same time." The attendant finally stepped forward, and for a moment, Elias thought the tension might break. But as he took the bag, the man muttered loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Some people think money makes them untouchable." Elias froze. The sentence cut through the cabin like a knife, sharp and deliberate. His spine straightened. Micah stirred gently in the carrier, letting out a sleepy coo, unaware of the storm forming around him. Elias met the attendant's eyes. "I'm sorry, what was that?" The man smiled thinly, placing the bag in the overhead bin. "I said some people like to travel light." He turned away without another word, disappearing toward the galley. Several passengers looked up from their devices. One man raised his eyebrows but quickly turned back to his book. Another across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. No one said anything. Elias lowered himself into the seat with quiet precision, adjusting Micah's head so the baby could rest against his chest. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. But inside, a familiar fire had been lit. He replayed the moment again and again. The words weren't just rude. They were loaded, aimed like a weapon, in the tone behind them. It wasn't just a bad day or misplaced frustration. It was personal. Elias leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes briefly. He thought about the conference room in Zurich, where he'd just closed the most important deal of his career. The ink was still drying on the partnership papers. This trip was supposed to be his return home, his victory lap. His wife had texted, "We'll have dinner ready. Micah's going to smile when he sees you. I just know it." He looked down at his son now. Micah was still asleep, unaware that anything had happened. But Elias knew better. He had felt this before, in the quiet moments when dignity was tested, when silence asked him to bear one more insult for the sake of peace. He reached up and pressed the call button, not to escalate, but because he still needed the blanket tucked into his carry-on. But the button stayed lit for several long minutes, unanswered. Flight attendants walked by. Not one stopped. When someone finally did return, it wasn't the same attendant. A stocky man with a buzz cut and an unmarked name tag leaned down and said in a flat voice, "You pressed the call light, sir." "I just need the blanket from my overhead," Elias said, gesturing up. "I'll see if I can get to it later." the attendant replied, already moving down the aisle. It wasn't just a bad mood, it was coordinated indifference. Elias clenched his jaw. The other passengers must have noticed, but no one said a word. The silence was heavy, oppressive. He rocked Micah gently, pretending the weight in his chest wasn't growing. From the galley, the first attendant, Marvin, he'd caught the name tag briefly, peeked out again, eyes locking on Elias. This time, there was no hiding the expression on his face. It was a challenge. Elias didn't look away. The air seemed to crackle with something unseen. Micah stirred in his sleep again. Elias laid a hand over the baby's back and whispered, "It's okay, buddy. We're just going home." But as the engines roared to life and the aircraft rolled onto the runway, Elias couldn't shake the sense that this flight wouldn't be routine. Something about Marvin's stare wasn't just unprofessional, it was dangerous. He glanced around the cabin once more. Some passengers avoided looking his way altogether. Others kept watching curiously, as though waiting for something to happen. No one spoke, no one questioned, and deep in his chest, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just unease, but a warning. The stage was set for a conflict that would not remain hidden. Turbulence jolted the plane, making overhead bins creak and cabin lights flicker. Elias Corrin instinctively tightened his arms around the baby carrier strapped to his chest. Micah stirred, then whimpered, a soft, tremulous sound that quickly grew into a sharp cry. Elias gently patted his son's back, whispering soothing words close to his ear. The baby's cries rose with each passing second, uncontainable and urgent, as if sensing the tension around them. The low hum of engines was no longer the only sound in the cabin. From the galley at the front, footsteps echoed, quick, deliberate, angry. Marvin Droll appeared in the aisle, face tight with barely concealed rage, his eyes locked onto Elias like heat-seeking missiles, cutting through rows of passengers who shrank into their seats. "Control your noise," Marvin snapped loud enough for everyone to hear. "Or I will." The words slithered through the air like a threat dressed in civility. A few passengers gasped. One man in business class leaned slightly forward, but quickly recoiled when Marvin's glare swept across him. No one else moved. No one dared. Elias straightened in his seat. His voice was calm but firm, honed by years in boardrooms and conference halls. "My child has every right to be comforted. This isn't a disruption. It's fatherhood." Marvin's jaw tightened. He looked around as if daring anyone to challenge him. When no one did, he turned back to Elias and smiled. Not kindly, but with the bitter satisfaction of someone about to exercise power unchecked. "I warned you." Without another word, Marvin spun on his heel and barked toward the rear of the plane. "Straps." Now Elias blinked. "Straps." The word tasted foreign on his tongue. "What are you doing?" "You'll see," Marvin muttered, already pulling a long restraint from a compartment in the galley wall. Another male flight attendant, a younger man with tired eyes, reluctantly followed, holding a second strap in his trembling hands. "Sir, I have done nothing to." Marvin cut him off with a cold smile. "You've disrupted the flight, provoked the crew, and ignored warnings. Time to calm you down." Before Elias could protest, Marvin reached over and yanked his arm to the side. The baby wailed louder, disturbed by the sudden movement. Elias twisted his torso to protect Micah, but that only provoked Marvin further. "Hold still," the senior attendant ordered. The younger one hesitated but obeyed, looping the strap around Elias's left wrist. Elias flinched as the synthetic fabric bit into his skin, pulled taut by experienced hands. "Is this necessary?" Elias asked, struggling to remain composed. "I'm holding an infant, which makes your tantrum even more dangerous," Marvin said, voice thick with sarcasm. "Safety first." With two swift pulls, both of Elias's arms were secured to the seat rest, locking him in place. His back pressed against the seat cushion, jaw clenched in disbelief. Passengers looked on in stunned silence. A few shifted, murmuring nervously, but still no one spoke out. Elias's mind reeled. He had endured many things in his life: racial profiling, corporate sabotage, silent judgment, but never this. Never being restrained like a threat in front of his crying child. "Please," he said, his voice quieter now. "Don't do this. My son is frightened." Marvin leaned down until his face was inches from Elias's. His breath smelled faintly of peppermint and malice. "Now watch," he whispered. "What happens when arrogance meets discipline?" Elias's eyes widened, but it wasn't the words that shook him. It was the certainty in Marvin's tone. There was no hesitation, no doubt. This wasn't a man making a mistake. This was a man enjoying it. Micah wailed uncontrollably now, his tiny fists flailing from the carrier. Elias wanted to cradle him, to rock him gently, but the straps dug into his wrists like shackles. He couldn't move. He couldn't protect his own child. A lump of rage swelled in his throat, but he forced himself to stay quiet. His breathing slowed. His eyes searched the cabin. Some passengers watched from behind shaded eyes. Others looked away entirely, pretending not to see. The younger flight attendant stood nearby, his lips parted as if he might speak, but he didn't. Elias could feel the fabric burning his wrists with every failed attempt to move. He grit his teeth, trying to focus his thoughts through the roar of helplessness. The very tools he used to close billion-dollar deals, composure, patience, strategic observation, were now his only weapons. But Marvin wasn't finished. He walked away slowly, casting glances back like a hunter admiring his prey. Elias followed him with his eyes, memorizing his posture, the weight of his footsteps, the smug twitch of his lips. This wasn't over. The cabin lights dimmed again, turbulence returning like a second wave. Elias looked down at his son, cheeks starred with tears, his body trembling in confusion. "I'm here, Micah," he whispered hoarsely. "I'm here." No one responded. No one moved. The baby's cries rang through the stillness like alarms in a church. Elias exhaled slow and quiet. A single thought formed in his mind. Not revenge, not yet. First, survive. Second, remember everything, because when the moment came, he would be ready. In that moment, the cabin became less a place of travel and more a theater of cruelty. Marvin's hand lunged without warning, seizing baby Micah from the carrier, strapped to Elias's chest with terrifying force. The child let out a startled wail, arms flailing instinctively in the air, his soft blue blanket unraveling as Marvin yanked him upward. The cabin air, once thick with silent tension, snapped into a high-pitched scream. Micah's scream that pierced every corner of the aircraft like glass shattering in a quiet room. Elias thrashed against the restraints, his entire body arching forward with the strength born of pure panic. The canvas straps dug deeper into his wrists and chest, burning hot lines into his skin. "No, give him back! Don't touch my son," he roared, voice breaking with both fury and terror. His head jerked side to side, searching the faces of passengers around him. Dozens of eyes stared back, some wide with horror, others frozen in disbelief, but no one moved. Marvin's expression was blank, disturbingly calm, as he turned toward the aisle. With deliberate cruelty, he raised the crying infant in his arms and slammed him, not with full force but with unmistakable intent, against the hard plastic of the nearby armrest. A collective gasp echoed through the plane, a sickening exhale of fear and shock. Micah's tiny body bounced from the impact, his cry breaking into a raw shriek of pain that silenced even the dull hum of the engines. The sound was unnatural, the kind that sliced straight through the chest of anyone with a beating heart. Elias's vision swam. His heart pounded so violently it felt as if it might tear itself apart in his chest. "Micah!" he screamed again, his voice shredded, barely human. He pulled against the straps with everything he had, the veins in his neck bulging, his muscles trembling under the strain. Blood began to seep from where the restraints bit into his skin, soaking into his sleeves. Two attendants stood frozen near the galley, the same ones who had helped Marvin earlier. Their eyes flicked nervously between Elias and their coworker, the realization dawning that this was no longer a matter of airline procedure. One of them, a younger man with a shaved head, took a tentative step forward, but Marvin whipped his head around. "Back off!" Marvin growled through clenched teeth. His voice was low but filled with menace. "Stay in your role or join him." The attendant stepped back immediately, eyes down, face pale. Around the cabin, the paralysis of fear began to shift. A middle-aged man in the third row raised his phone just slightly, angling the camera toward the aisle. Another passenger, a younger man with glasses, did the same, hands shaking as he tried to hold steady. The metallic clink of buckles and tray tables echoed as passengers subtly shifted to get better views. Hope flickered in Elias's eyes. Yes, he thought. Someone's recording. Someone will see this. It won't disappear. But hope was a fragile thing in the hands of cruelty. Marvin's head turned sharply, his eyes locking onto the man with glasses. In a voice loud enough to silence the growing stir, he barked, "Put the phone away unless you want to be forcibly removed. Recording is prohibited. That's your only warning." The man's face drained of color. He looked down immediately and fumbled to close the camera. Others followed suit, screens dimming, hands vanishing into laps or seat pockets. The brief rebellion was snuffed out in an instant. Elias watched helplessly as the phones disappeared one by one, as if hope itself was being swallowed by silence. His breath caught, and something in him broke, something vital. He slammed his head back against the seat in frustration, a guttural sound escaping his throat. Marvin turned back toward him slowly, holding Micah now with a casual grip that made Elias's blood run cold. The flight attendant tilted his head and smirked slightly, as if daring Elias to speak again. His eyes were empty. No remorse, no concern, just the smug glow of unchecked power. "You wanted to show off," Marvin muttered, just loud enough for Elias to hear. "Now you can sit there and watch what happens when arrogance meets discipline?" Elias shook his head, trembling, his voice rising in desperation. "He's just a baby. You're hurting him. Somebody do something." But no one moved. Some passengers looked away. Others kept their eyes glued to the seatback screens or tray tables, pretending not to hear, not to see. A man near the emergency exit pulled his cap down lower. The silence wasn't just fear, it was shame. And through it all, Micah kept crying, his tiny choked sobs the only protest that could not be silenced. Elias's mind spun wild and directionless, cycling between rage, helplessness, and guilt. How had this happened? How could this be real? He thought of his wife's voice on the last call, how she said, "Just get home safe, okay?" He thought of Micah's first laugh just 3 nights ago, and the way his son's fingers curled around his thumb. And now here he was, restrained, humiliated, forced to watch his child be brutalized by a man in uniform while the world looked away. Every second of helplessness carved fury into his bones. Marvin's grip tightened on the strap as he reached across Elias's body, the nylon digging deeper into the CEO's already bruised arm. The pressure made Elias W's, but he refused to give Marvin the satisfaction of a sound. Micah let out another loud, frightened cry, his tiny hands trembling against the buckles of his carrier. The noise pierced the cabin like a blade, but it wasn't the infant's cry that shifted the moment. It was the hesitation in the hands of the junior flight attendant beside them. Darvin Hall stood stiffly, holding the final strap in both hands like it was something venomous. He was young, no older than 23, with wide, uncertain eyes and a shaved jawline that still bore the softness of inexperience. His fingers trembled, betraying the war inside him. Beads of sweat gathered at his temple as he looked down at Elias, then back at Marvin, whose expression was now a thundercloud of expectation and fury. Darvin started, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't right." The words weren't loud, but they cut through the hum of the aircraft like a dropped glass. The 2 attendants near the galley froze, their heads turning slightly. A passenger halfway down the aisle coughed awkwardly, unsure if he had truly heard what he thought he had. Marvin's head snapped around, his eyes narrowed to slits, his jaw tightening so hard the veins at his temple bulged. He stepped toward Darvin with slow, heavy steps, his boots thudding softly against the thin cabin carpet. For a brief moment, the sound of Micah's whimpering seemed to fade, replaced by the heavy tension of a confrontation that hovered just a breath away from combustion. "Do your job," Marvin hissed, his face inches from Darvin's, "or join him in the seat." Darvin's grip slackened slightly and the strap sagged toward the floor. The young attendant's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. The fear in his eyes wasn't just of Marvin. It was of consequence, of backlash, of a system that rewarded silence and punished truth. With a defeated step back, Darwin handed the strap over and turned his face away, ashamed. Elias watched everything. Even with pain throbbing through his arms, shoulders, and chest, his mind remained sharp. The tension was real, the threat immediate, but in that flicker of hesitation, he saw something more important than cruelty. He saw doubt, a weakness in Marvin's iron grip on control. A single breath of defiance in a cabin full of fear. Their eyes met, Elias's and Darwin's. It lasted no more than a second, but in that glance something passed between them. Not a plea, not a demand, a challenge, a silent vow. Elias wasn't asking for a savior. He was asking Darwin to remember who he was. He exhaled slowly, pretending to slump back against the seat. But inside, his body was a forge. Micah cried, "No!" wailed beside him in the carrier, his little arms flailing, legs twitching in confusion and terror. The baby's cries were no longer soft coos. They were desperate now, hoarse arse, trembling sobs that echoed through the cabin. Elias turned his head just slightly to whisper to him, though he knew Micah could not understand. "I'm here," he murmured. "I see you. I hear you." The sounds of suffering fed the storm inside Elias. His son had done nothing. And yet here they were, punished, restrained, humiliated. For what? For daring to exist in first class. For being black and successful and unapologetically present. A passenger across the aisle, an older man in a gray blazer, shifted uncomfortably. He made eye contact with Elias just for a second, then looked down at his folded hands. No one spoke. No one moved. The cabin remained a theater of cowardice. Marvin laughed again, a short, cutting chuckle. "That baby sure is loud. Wonder where he gets it from." The cruelty wasn't even hidden now. Elias clenched his fists inside the bindings. He shifted his wrist as lightly. The strap gave just a fraction, just enough. His heart leapt. He masked the movement by leaning into the seat cushion and coughing lightly. He tested it again, more deliberately this time. The knot at his left wrist was uneven, loose at the base. In Marvin's rush to assert dominance, he had sacrificed control for spectacle. Elias's mind raced. He thought back to a leadership retreat he had once dismissed as indulgent. Executive survival training in the Colorado wilderness. He'd learned how to slip from zip ties, how to remain calm under pressure. Back then, he'd smirked at the absurdity of it. Now those lessons were all he had. Every movement had to be calculated. Premature action would result in failure and possibly greater harm to Micah. The plane shifted again, a smaller jolt, but enough to make the cabin lights flicker briefly. A murmur rose from the back. Marvin, unbothered, crouched to pick up a service tray that had clattered to the floor. As he rose, his eyes locked on Elias once more. "You know what your problem is," Marvin said, stepping closer until his shadow fell across Elias's knees. "You think the world works on respect, but it works on obedience, and right now you obey." He tapped Elias's forehead with 2 fingers, a mock salute that made the passengers collectively hold their breath. Micah cried harder, his cheeks red, his tiny fist trembling. Elias didn't flinch, not visibly, but his eyes burned with fire. He turned his focus inward, pressing his forearm outward against the strap, testing the limit. The skin scraped raw. He welcomed the pain. It was proof of progress. Another inch, another breath. He glanced to the beverage cart nearby, where Darwin Hole, the junior flight attendant, stood watching, pretending to check inventory. Darwin's hand trembled slightly as he rearranged unopened cans. Elias studied him for a beat. The young man's jaw was tight, his knuckles white. He wasn't aligned with Marvin. That much was clear. There was hesitation in him, and where there is hesitation, there is possibility. Micah hiccuped through his sobs. Elias's heart fractured again. He leaned ever so slightly to the left, twisting the strap harder against the buckle. It bit into his skin, grinding against the bone. Almost there. He didn't stop. The plane rocked again. This time, stronger, enough to make Marvin stumble a second time, grabbing a headrest to steady himself. Elias felt the strap give another inch. The blood in his ears roared. Soon he whispered under his breath, eyes flickering between the buckle and the man who had dared to turn his child into a pawn. The cabin had fallen into a hush. No more laughter, No more phone fumbling, just the hum of the engines and the weeping of an innocent child. Dramatic irony thickened the air like smoke. To everyone watching, Elias remained a powerless man, strapped down, humiliated, defeated. Only he knew the truth. Only he could feel the slip of the knot, the ache in his wrist, the slow, grinding march toward freedom. He closed his eyes for half a breath, steeling himself. Every movement now mattered. Every second counted. He would not strike yet, but he was close, very close. He opened his eyes again and stared at Marvin and thought to himself. The strap tightened once more around Elias's chest as Marvin pulled it snug, yanking it with unnecessary force. Elias grunted quietly, jaw clenched against the pain, but he refused to look away from Darvin, who now lingered by the beverage cart, pretending to organize cups and napkins. The man's hands moved, but his eyes remained fixed on Elias and the baby. Ellis closed his eyes for a heartbeat, centering himself against the chaos. His breathing slowed, shallow and deliberate. Beneath the noise, beneath the humiliation, a different kind of focus took hold. He shifted slightly in the seat, flexing his fingers, rotating his wrists slowly, subtly. The strap around his right arm had been hastily secured, the knot tied with the kind of arrogance that only comes when a man believes he's already won. Marvin's mistake. His fury had made him careless. Elias tested the give and the buckle, recalling lessons buried under years of board meetings and polished speeches. Long ago at a company retreat meant to build resilience. A former special forces trainer had run them through emergency drills, how to escape restraints, how to stay calm under pressure, how to turn patience into power. Elias had scoffed at the time, wondering why a tech executive needed to know how to escape zip ties. Now in a dark cabin filled with whispers, he thanked every second of that strange weekend. He shifted again just slightly, pretending to stretch against the seat. The rough fabric of the strap scraped his skin, but he felt something important. The knot wasn't double-looped. With enough pressure and precision, it could be worked loose. Micah whimpered again, and Elias turned his face just enough to meet his son's gaze. The baby's cheeks were red, his little hands trembling near his face. Elias's heart ached, but he didn't let it break. He let it harden. He would not be broken. From the corner of his eye, he caught movement. Darvin again, still pretending to fuss with the cart, but his hand had frozen above the cup dispenser. He was watching, listening, thinking. Elias didn't speak. There was no need. The air between them now carried more than fear. It carried expectation. Marvin stomped down the aisle again, barking at a pair of passengers to turn off their phones. He was growing bolder, more erratic, and Elias knew the window to act was closing. He twisted his wrist again slowly, deliberately. The strap dug deeper into his skin, tearing a thin layer free, but the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation, compared to the fury. The knot shifted ever so slightly, a single millimeter. But it was enough. A plan began to take shape. He would wait for the next distraction, the next turbulence. He would free himself and find his child. And if Marvin tried to stop him, he would face a different man than the one he tied to the seat. The cabin hummed with quiet dread. But beneath it, something else stirred. In the silence between screams, a plan began to breathe. The plane trembled violently as another burst of turbulence rocked the cabin. Overhead, bins rattled. Cups clinked on trays. Passengers gasped softly, white-knuckled hands gripping armrests. Marvin Droll, standing in the aisle with a smug smirk stretched across his face, nearly lost his balance. He staggered, catching himself with a hand on the seat back beside Elias Korn. The turbulence passed, but the charge in the air remained. Marvin didn't miss a beat. Turning slowly toward the restrained CEO, he spread his arms as if addressing an audience at a show. "See this man," Marvin announced, his voice loud and theatrical. "Fortune and power mean nothing when the straps hold you down." The words echoed like a slap in the already tense silence. Gasps rippled again, but no one rose. A middle-aged man in row 9 looked away. A young couple near the rear of the plane whispered behind trembling fingers. One man instinctively reached for his phone, then stopped short when Marvin's eyes landed on him. Elias did not respond, not with words. His jaw tightened, not in defeat, but in a quiet fury that had simmered past boiling. He refused to drop his gaze. His muscles tensed against the binding straps, and he focused, truly focused, on everything around him. The way Marvin's weight shifted with each step, the pattern in which he leaned toward the baby carrier and retreated like a vulture teasing its prey. The other flight attendants' positions, their uncertain stances, their eyes avoiding his. Elias's breath slowed. He felt the seatbelt buckle digging into his wrist, the nylon strap wrapped too hastily in Marvin's rage. The angle wasn't secure. It pressed into his skin, but not deep enough, not tightly enough. A rush of possibility sparked behind his eyes. He would not remain a prisoner much longer. Marvin Droll's hand moved with a sharp, deliberate jerk as he hoisted baby Micah from the carrier, strapped to Elias's chest. The suddenness of it tore a gasp from the cabin. Elias's breath caught. His body jerked forward instinctively, but the straps bit into his wrists, holding him down. His entire frame trembled with the urge to rise, to snatch his son back, but the restraint held fast. His voice cracked as he yelled, "Stop! He's just a baby!" The words came out raw, edged in desperation. Passengers flinched. Some turned their heads, unable to look. Others leaned forward slightly, uncomfortable, but still frozen by the weight of fear. No one moved. Marvin stood beside Elias now, the child dangling in his arms like a prop, like something less than human. His fingers curled around Micah's small frame, not with care, but with cold detachment. The overhead light above row 8 flickered faintly, casting a pale glow across Marvin's sharp features. His smirk returned, thin-lipped, cruel. "You don't give orders here," Marvin sneered under his breath, his voice low enough to miss the cockpit, but loud enough to scrape across Elias's nerves like broken glass. Elias's head throbbed with the weight of helplessness, but inside a fire roared hotter. He pulled hard against the straps. The edges dug into his skin, tearing through layers already raw. His pulse raced. He had tried everything to keep calm for Micah's sake, for the other passengers, for the tiny hope that someone might intervene. But now his child's life teetered on the edge of an armrest. At the far end of the aisle, Darvin Halt stood by the beverage cart, pretending to sort cups, but his hands were shaking. His eyes, though trying not to linger, kept drifting toward the scene unfolding in row 8. A small sweat stain darkened the collar of his uniform shirt. His jaw clenched so tightly the skin twitched with every movement Marvin made. Elias saw him. He saw the guilt in the young man's eyes and the fear. As Marvin adjusted his grip on Micah, bringing the child dangerously close to the curved edge of the armrest again, Elias felt the world slow. Every beat of his heart echoed like thunder in his ears. He tested the strap once more, and this time it moved. A sliver, barely a shift in tension, but it was there. He forced himself to breathe slowly, despite the rage threatening to tear him apart. If he moved too soon, he'd be caught. If he yelled again, he'd draw more attention. He needed precision now and time. He tilted his head just enough to speak sideways, his voice a low rasp meant for one man only. "Help me, and this ends differently." Darvin's head jerked slightly. The words had hit their mark, but he didn't move. Not yet. The muscles in his neck tensed as if bracing for an explosion. His eyes shifted from Elias to Marvin, then down to the floor. He wiped his hands on his pants once, twice as if scrubbing away guilt that wouldn't lift. Still, he didn't speak. Elias's hands, hidden beneath the armrest's shadow, twisted against the loop restraints. He rolled his wrist inward, then outward, the strap slipping against slickened skin. Blood pry-cricked through the torn edges of his knuckles, but he didn't stop. Every inch of pain became fuel. He knew he couldn't waste the crack forming in Marvin's control. He had to widen it. Marvin stepped forward again, holding Micah loosely. The child whimpered, his cries quieter now, but no less painful. His tiny face was blotched red from distress, his arms twitching, legs kicking at air. Elias's breath hitched. Marvin leaned closer, tauntingly. "He's soft, like all babies. Do you think yours is different?" Elias's fist clenched, his teeth ground together. He wanted to scream, to tear through the straps and lunge forward, but he couldn't. Not yet. Darvin took a step forward without realizing. His foot tapped against the metal brace of the cart. The sound snapped him out of his hesitation, and he stepped back quickly as if caught in a crime. But Elias had seen it. So had Marvin. Marvin turned his head sharply. "Stay out of this," he warned, voice venomous. Darvin nodded quickly. "Yes, sir," he mumbled, lowering his gaze. But the tightness in his jaw returned. Elias seized the opportunity. He pushed the strap again, twisting his wrist hard. A sharper pain lanced through his forearm, but the strap slipped more. Almost there. Almost free. He exhaled slowly and dropped his voice again, even quieter. "I don't need you to fight him. Just stop him from hurting my son." Darvin's brows furrowed. His eyes flicked toward Micah again. For a moment, everything in the cabin seemed to pause. The whirring fans above, the faint engine hum, the murmurs between passengers, all suspended in anticipation. Elias waited. Darvin didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. The scene threatened to collapse under its own tension. Marvin adjusted the baby again, more aggressively this time. "Maybe next time you'll fly private," he said with a mocking chuckle. Elias's fists flexed. He could feel the last threads of the knot slipping. Just a little more. He leaned his head back, eyes closed as if giving in, but his lips moved once more. "Help me, and this ends differently." Darvin froze, his conscience screaming louder than Marvin's threats. The tension teetered at the edge of collapse. One man's courage could topple another's cruelty. When the plane jolted again, this time harder than before, Elias didn't hesitate. The sudden turbulence sent a rattle through the cabin, causing overhead compartments to creak and cups to wobble on tray tables. Passengers clutched their armrests, some gasping aloud, others instinctively looking toward the crew for reassurance. But Elias had no such luxury. He seized the moment. With every ounce of strength, he twisted his arm against the strap that bound him. The rough nylon bit into his skin, tearing it open with a quiet rip that felt louder than the engine's hum. Pain flashed like fire through his nerves, but he didn't stop. His breath hitched. Blood began to beat at his wrist, dark and hot, but the knot, imperfectly tied in Marvin's rush, finally gave way. It slipped just enough for Elias to wriggle one arm free. He froze. His instincts screamed to leap forward, to tear Marvin apart with bare hands. But he didn't move yet. He kept his posture stiff, pretending the strap still held. Every second counted, and this would be the last time Marvin ever underestimated him. In front of him, the cruel flight attendant leaned in close to baby Micah. The infant's cries hadn't stopped since the violence began, and now his sobs were, his tiny face red and streaked with tears. Marvin crouched beside him, eyes gleaming with something that wasn't just malice, it was control. "You think you're a powerful man, don't you?" Marvin whispered, his voice low and cutting. "But power doesn't mean anything when you're tied up and your baby's in my hands." Elias's jaw clenched. He couldn't afford to blink. His free hand now hovered just above his thigh, hidden from view by the shadows of his seat. His breathing slowed, deepened, just like it had during high-stakes negotiations. Focus. Focus or lose everything. Marvin turned slightly, reaching to adjust Micah's blanket with a mocking gentleness that made Elias's blood boil. That movement just enough. Elias moved like a spring coiled tight for far too long. Elias exploded out of his seat. The second strap ripped free, snapping across the aisle like a whip. Gasps erupted around him. A woman dropped her drink. A man across the aisle flinched backwards so quickly his headphones flew off. Marvin spun around just in time to see Elias coming, eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time since boarding, Elias saw real fear in the man's expression. Elias's feet pounded the narrow carpet, his momentum unstoppable. "Give me my son!" he roared, voice shaking the air. He lunged forward, arms outstretched. Marvin staggered back instinctively, clutching Micah tighter, the baby now wailing in confusion and terror. The sudden movement caused Marvin to lose balance, and he stumbled against the edge of the beverage cart. His grip on Micah faltered. In the blur of chaos, Darvin Hall, young, nervous, and still standing by the beverage cart, snapped into action. Without thinking, he surged forward and caught the baby just as Marvin's grip slipped. His arms closed around Micah protectively, holding the child against his chest like something sacred. Darvin's face was pale, his hands shaking, but his body anchored with purpose. "I've got him!" he shouted. Elias didn't slow. He closed the gap between him and Marvin, crashing into the man with the weight of a father's fury. They collided near the galley, shoulders smashing. Marvin's back hitting the metal door with a loud thud. The breath whooshed from his lungs and he slumped for half a second, just enough time for Elias to draw back his arm. But he didn't strike. Not yet. He stared into Marvin's eyes, watching them dart. First to the passengers now watching in stunned silence, then to Darvin holding Micah, then back to Elias. The mask of authority Marvin had worn so smugly was gone. In its place was a man unraveling. "You thought I was done," Elias growled low and deliberate, his voice shaking with controlled rage. "But you were never in control. You were just first in line to fall." Marvin opened his mouth, maybe to defend himself, maybe to lash out, but the words never came. He saw it now. The game was over. Passengers stared, mouths open, afraid to speak, yet unable to look away. The silence in the cabin roared louder than any engine. Darvin stepped back, still holding Micah, his body curled protectively around the infant. His eyes met Elias's for a split second, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Fear had nearly won, but not tonight. The tide had turned, and in that moment every man, woman, and child on that flight knew that Elias Corrin was no longer the restrained man in seat 14A. He had become something far more dangerous. The dramatic irony struck deep. The man they had watched be tied, humiliated, silenced. He had been waiting, planning, enduring, and now he had taken back everything. The hunter had just become the prey. Marvin's grip on baby Micah slipped the moment Elias struck his arm. The blow, swift and deliberate, sent a shock through the flight attendant's body, and his hold loosened just enough for the infant to be snatched away. Darvin, the junior attendant, who had been frozen at the edge of the aisle, surged forward and caught the baby just before he could fall. His arms trembled as he clutched the child to his chest, stepping back as if shielding Micah from a blast. The baby let out a sharp, frightened cry that echoed across the cabin, louder than any engine hum, louder than any announcement. It cut through the air like a siren of truth. Something irreversible had just happened. Passengers jolted in their seats, some spilling drinks, others gasping audibly. Trays clattered to the floor. One man ducked instinctively as if expecting something to explode. The narrow aisle turned into a corridor of confusion and fear. A steward from the back of the plane looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief, but he didn't move. He watched. Marvin's snarl deepened. His voice was hoarse and cracked from the effort of his rage. "Give him back," he growled, lunging at Darvin with clawed fingers. But Elias stepped in front of him with force, intercepting the charge. Their bodies collided like two trains meeting on the same track. Marvin staggered slightly, surprised by Elias's strength, but he recovered fast, throwing his weight into a shove that sent them both stumbling sideways into the narrow row of seats. The struggle that followed was raw, chaotic, and fueled by something deeper than anger. Elias fought not just as a father, but as a man reclaiming his humanity. Every movement was driven by purpose. His fists were not wild. They were precise, controlled, and sharp, the product of a mind that refused to let trauma define him. Marvin, for all his aggression, was unprepared for the sheer willpower behind Elias's retaliation. Around them, passengers ducked, some cowering behind their seatbacks, others standing awkwardly, uncertain whether to intervene or stay silent. Phones were raised hesitantly, half hidden by sleeves and seatbacks. One man whispered to his seatmate, "Should we stop it?" but received no answer. Elias managed to pin Marvin briefly against a row of seats, his forearm pressed against the man's chest, holding him in place as he spoke through gritted teeth. "You don't touch my son ever again." Marvin spit to the side, his voice still brimming with misplaced authority. "You think you're above the rules? You think money gives you the right to?" But Elias pressed harder, silencing him mid-sentence. He glanced behind him and saw Darvin standing at the rear of the aisle, holding Micah close, his face pale but determined. Elias nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. Darvin didn't move, just shifted his stance to cradle the child more securely. Then came the hesitation, the moment that would decide what happened next. The second attendant, the one who had helped restrain Elias earlier, stood a few feet away, frozen. Marvin, seeing him, barked orders like a captain losing control of his ship. "Hold him down now." The attendant stepped forward slightly, then paused. His eyes met Elias's for a heartbeat, then flicked to the bleeding wrist where the restraint had torn skin. His shoulders sagged. He didn't move. Marvin saw it too. "What are you doing?" I said. "Help me." But the man didn't speak. He stepped back instead. Elias felt the shift, not just in the fight, but in the air. It was no longer just him versus Marvin. It was the slow crumbling of fear. The silence of the passengers began to crack. A child across the aisle whimpered. A man near the emergency exit looked up, startled as though shaken from sleep. The illusion of Marvin's authority was fading fast. Still, the flight attendant fought. He swung with wild arms, catching Elias in the side with a sharp jab of his elbow. Elias recoiled. The wind knocked out of him momentarily, but he gritted through it. His mind sharpened. This wasn't just about getting justice anymore. It was about making sure no one ever questioned who was the victim here. He pivoted, using his shoulder to slam Marvin backward again. The older man stumbled, nearly tripping over the leg of a passenger seat, but caught himself and launched forward in one final desperate surge. Their fists collided in the middle of the aisle. It was brutal, but Elias stayed steady. He knew he couldn't lose control, couldn't afford to become what Marvin would later try to claim, a violent man, a threat. Every strike was measured, every movement anchored to the image of Micah's terrified face. Then, as if summoned by the chaos itself, a deep, commanding voice cut through the madness. "That's enough." Everyone turned. Captain Rayard Straw stood at the threshold of the forward cabin, his presence commanding attention. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly combed, but his face was lined with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. He looked first to Marvin, disheveled and red-faced, then to Elias, chest heaving and eyes burning with fury. Behind them, the child's soft cries continued, a soundtrack to the violence that had taken place. The captain took a breath, slow and deliberate, then stepped forward with authority. "Order will be restored one way or another." They thought humiliating a black CEO and his child mid-flight would go unanswered. But justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Captain Rayard Straw stepped into the cabin just as the echo of the last shout faded. The narrow aisle was a mess of upturned trays, spilled drinks, and shocked faces. His eyes, sharp and weathered by decades in the skies, instantly caught the sight of a man bleeding from the wrists, Elias Corrin, and a young flight attendant cradling a wailing infant, his hands trembling like leaves in a storm. The air was thick, not just with recycled oxygen, but with the heavy tension of something terrible having just occurred. "What is going on here?" the captain demanded, his voice low but firm, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Marvin Droll was the first to respond, his face flushed with a mix of rage and desperation. He took 2 brisk steps forward, his posture stiff with forced authority. "Captain," he said quickly, gesturing toward Elias, "this man attacked me. He endangered the baby, became hostile. I had to act." Elias, still catching his breath, pointed to the torn restraints that dangled from his seat like evidence at a crime scene. "He tied me down," Elias said, his voice but steady. "Then he took my son and slammed him against the armrest. I didn't attack him. I broke free to save my child." A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Some passengers shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact, while others sat frozen, eyes wide, afraid to speak. From somewhere in the middle rows, a hesitant voice whispered, "He's telling the truth." Another followed, quieter still. "I saw what happened, but the whispers weren't enough." Reynard's eyes flicked between the 2 men. He noted the raw wounds on Elias's wrists, the bruising around his arms. He noticed the sweat on Marvin's brow, not just from exertion, but from fear. And then his gaze locked on Darvin Hall, the junior attendant, still standing to the side, holding the baby with both arms, as if shielding the child from the chaos that had unfolded. "You," the captain said, pointing at Darvin, his voice now sharp. "What happened?" Darvin flinched. He opened his mouth, then closed it, staring at the infant in his arms. The baby whimpered softly, his tiny face flushed from crying. Darvin's hands tightened protectively around him. He looked up, his eyes meeting the captain's. "I?" Darvin swallowed hard. His voice trembled. "I." But then he glanced toward Marvin, who shot him a warning glare sharp enough to cut glass. Captain Rayard noticed the exchange. His brow furrowed. "I need the truth now," he said. "This isn't going away." Quietly, Elias's heart pounded in his chest. Every second that passed felt like a rope tightening around his future. He had fought, bled, and risked everything in the last few minutes, but none of it would matter if the truth drowned in silence. Darvin looked at Elias, looked at Micah, then at Marvin. He said nothing. Marvin took the silence as an opportunity to reassert his authority. "Captain, this man is violent. He tore through restraints. He could have hurt people. I was doing my duty. He tied me down." Elias interrupted, his voice rising with urgency without cause. "And then he used my son like a prop to humiliate me. Look at him." He pointed to Micah again. "My son's been crying for 20 minutes straight, and no one helped." Captain Raynard turned his gaze to Elias once more. He studied him carefully, the CEO's ripped shirt, his bloodied wrists, the shaking in his arms as he tried to stay standing. But there was something in Elias's eyes that stopped the captain cold. It wasn't desperation, it was something deeper, a kind of fire that only came from someone who had tasted injustice more times than he could count. "I need passenger statements," the captain said finally, looking around. Silence. No one moved, no one spoke. Then Marvin, emboldened, stepped forward again. "You see, Captain, he's trying to twist this. People like him." "Enough!" the captain snapped. That single word broke through the fog of fear. A man in the third row cleared his throat. "I saw him tied. I saw the baby get yanked." Another voice from the back. I saw too. I didn't want to get involved, but now the tide was shifting. Marvin's face powled, but still Captain Rayard didn't speak. His eyes returned to Darvin once more. The junior attendant stood frozen, the baby in his arms sniffling softly now. Darvin's lips parted, but again he hesitated. Elias stepped closer, his voice calm but powerful. "Tell the truth. You don't owe him silence. You owe that baby the truth." The plane hummed quietly beneath their feet, a subtle reminder that even thousands of feet in the air, justice still had to be grounded in courage. Darvin inhaled sharply, the decision finally taking root in his chest. And then, with the quiet strength of someone who had reached his breaking point, he whispered, "He's telling the truth." The words were soft, but they rang louder than any command. Every head turned. The passengers who had sat in silence now leaned forward. Elias felt his knees weaken, not from defeat, but from the sudden release of tension that had kept him coiled like a spring. Marvin's mouth opened, but no sound came. His eyes darted between Rayard and Darvin, panic beginning to form. "You traitor!" Marvin hissed, stepping toward the younger attendant. Darvin stepped back, but Marvin didn't stop. His face twisted in fury and he lunged. Elias was faster. He moved without thinking, intercepting Marvin with a forceful block. Their bodies collided again, but this time Elias was grounded, strong, ready. The captain barked, "That's enough!" But the two men were already locked in motion. Marvin swinging wildly, Elias dodging, blocking, shoving him backward into the galley wall. Passengers cried out. A drink cart toppled. The plane rattled slightly, but the real turbulence was inside the cabin. It wasn't chaos. It was clarity. Elias was no longer bound. He was no longer silent. He struck clean, not to hurt, but to stop. Each motion was precise, controlled, powerful. Marvin stumbled backward, dazed, and just as the captain stepped in and separated them, his voice full of final authority. The moment shifted completely. Marvin's reign was over. The passengers sat in stunned silence. The baby's soft coo, the only sound breaking through. And then Elias, bloodied but unbowed, raised his voice not in anger, but in unshakable truth. No one uses a uniform to crush a father and child. The truth hovered in the air, waiting for a single voice to set it free. The captain's silence stretched long enough to choke the air from the cabin. Elias's breath came in short bursts, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The straps had cut deep into his skin, raw, bloody and burning, but he barely noticed the pain anymore. All his focus was on Captain Rayard's straw, whose face betrayed the storm behind his calm exterior. The man stood firm near the front galley, arms slightly outstretched as if holding the tension in place by sheer force. His eyes flicked from Marvin's scowl to Elias's injuries, then to the baby, still trembling in Darvin's arms near the beverage cart. Everyone waited. "Arrest him when we land, Captain," Marvin barked, stepping forward and pointing a rigid finger at Elias like a trial lawyer before a jury. "He's a danger to everyone. He broke free and attacked me." His voice carried through the rows like a hammer, striking fear into the passengers. Some leaned back, others averted their eyes. A few glanced between the captain and the restrained man, whose silence made more noise than any words could. Elias didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on Reinard's pleading, not with desperation, but with truth. He had nothing else left to give. His wrists ached, but his will stood firm. Then, breaking the unbearable stillness, a quiet voice spoke from behind Marvin. "No, he's the one telling the truth." All heads turned. Darvin Holt's voice, though trembling, rang out like a crack of thunder through dry air. The junior flight attendant stood frozen for a heartbeat, his face pale but resolute. The baby in his arms stirred slightly, as if even Micah understood the weight of that moment. Marvin turned slowly, his face darkening. "You traitor!" he hissed, his voice no longer calm or controlled, his features twisted, contorted by something far uglier than anger. Fear, maybe, or the realization that his grip on power had just been broken. He lunged forward, not at Elias, but at Darvin. But Elias moved first. With a surge of instinct honed by desperation, he stepped between them, slamming his body into Marvin's path like a shield. The collision echoed through the narrow aisle as trays clattered and passengers gasped. Marvin stumbled back in surprise, but recovered quickly, fists clenched, teeth bared. This time Elias didn't fight like a restrained man struggling against injustice. He fought like a father reclaiming his place in the world. He delivered a short, powerful punch to Marvin's chest, enough to knock the air from him. Marvin reeled, surprised by the strength, but swung back wildly. Elias ducked, pivoting, and landed another blow to Marvin's ribs. A passenger in seat 11B let out a small cheer, quickly silenced by the rising tension. Around them, the cabin became a frozen theater. Dozens of eyes watching, holding breath, too frightened to speak, but unable to look away. Darvin backed up quickly, shielding Micah behind the beverage cart, his eyes wide. The baby whimpered softly, but the chaos around him somehow seemed to pause in Elias's mind. All he saw was Marvin, and all he felt was purpose. Marvin swung again, this time connecting. His fist cracked against Elias's jaw, sending pain radiating down his neck. But Elias didn't retreat. He grabbed Marvin's shirt and shoved him hard into the bulkhead. "You won't touch him again," he growled, voice low, breath ragged. Suddenly, a firm voice shouted over the noise. "That's enough!" Captain Reynard stepped forward at last, his voice ringing with command. He placed himself between them with surprising speed and authority, forcing both men apart with the weight of his presence alone. "This ends now," he said, looking between Elias and Marvin. "Everyone stand down." Elias stepped back, still breathing hard. Blood trickled from his lip, but he refused to wipe it away. Marvin, panting and shaken, tried to speak, but his words faltered. The captain's eyes held him frozen in place. Darvin took a step forward, his voice steadier this time. "I saw it all." He tied Mr. Corrin down. He slammed the baby. "That's a lie," Marvin interrupted, voice shrill, but no one echoed him. Silence thickened. Even the other flight attendants, once frozen by fear or allegiance, stood off to the side. Silent witnesses to the unraveling. One of them lowered his eyes. Another took a step away from Marvin. Captain Reynard slowly turned his attention to Elias. His gaze was not warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was calculating, like a man piecing together a puzzle while the world watched. Elias didn't blink, and in that silence between heartbeats, between the last punch and the next decision, the air shifted. The passengers saw it too. Some sat up straighter. Others whispered. The truth had found its first voice. Now it waited for a second. The captain stepped forward, looking at Darvin, then at Marvin, then back to Elias. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said, his voice firm. Elias nodded once, cradling his injured wrist against his side. He looked down at Micah in Darvin's arms, who was slowly calming, small hands twitching against the flight attendant's sleeve. But even as orders seemed to return, Marvin's chest heaved with fury. He wasn't done. Not yet. He reached behind him almost suddenly and grabbed a service tray from the galley wall. With one last cry of fury, he swung it overhead toward Elias's skull. Elias turned just in time. The tray clipped his shoulder, knocking him sideways, but he caught himself on a seat armrest and spun back. In one swift motion, he grabbed Marvin's wrist and twisted. The tray clattered to the floor with a metallic ring. Passengers cried out. Someone ducked, but Elias didn't move to strike again. He held Marvin's arm locked in place, forcing him to the side, eyes blazing with control. From behind, two other attendants rushed forward, finally breaking their silence. At Rayard's nod, they grabbed Marvin, prying him from Elias's grip and forcing him against the cabin wall. "Let go!" Marvin shouted, struggling. "This is all wrong. He's manipulating you." But no one listened. "Not anymore." As Marvin writhed against the arms holding him down, Darvin carefully handed Micah back to Elias. The father took his son with reverent care, holding him close, whispering words only the child could hear. His voice trembled, but his arms did not. Captain Rayard stepped closer to Marvin, looking into the man's eyes as if seeing him for the first time. "Secure him," he said, and they did. Ilias stood tall, Micah nestled safely against his chest once more. His eyes scanned the passengers, some wide-eyed, some quietly crying, others mouthing silent prayers of gratitude. Then he turned toward Marvin and said clearly for all to hear, no one uses a uniform to crush a father and child." The cabin falls into reverent silence. The truth had spoken, and its echo was unstoppable. Marvin lunged without warning. With a snarl twisted into his face, he grabbed a metal service tray from the galley wall and swung it like a weapon toward Elias's head. The move was sudden, vicious, and desperate. A metallic blur tore through the air. Elias barely had time to raise his arm. The tray struck his shoulder with a sickening thud. Pain exploded down his side, but he didn't fall. He gritted his teeth, staggered slightly, then turned with unflinching focus. For a heartbeat, the cabin froze. Elias's breath came sharp through his nose. The sharp scent of plastic and stale coffee filled his lungs, grounding him in the chaos. He could hear Micah's soft, frightened whimper somewhere behind him, proof that this wasn't over. The pain in his arm radiated like fire, but he welcomed it. It reminded him what he was fighting for. Marvin reared back for another blow, but Elias moved first. With practiced instinct, he stepped inside the swing, closed the distance, and grabbed Marvin's wrist with his uninjured hand. His fingers dug deep into the tendons. Marvin grunted, trying to twist away, but Elias shifted his weight, torqued his body, and wrenched the attendant's wrist sharply. The tray clattered to the floor with a hollow final clang. The cabin erupted, not in chaos, but in subtle rising energy. A man in row 5 clapped once, then stopped himself, unsure. A woman near the bulkhead exhaled audibly, her hand to her mouth. Another passenger murmured, "He stopped him." For the first time since the nightmare began, the tide had visibly shifted. Elias didn't let go. He stared Marvin down close enough to see the sweat beating at the man's temple, the sudden flicker of doubt in his eyes. That mask of control, once so smug, so confident, had fractured. Now it was Elias who stood unwavering, his breath steady, his voice low. "You don't get to touch him," he growled. "Not anymore." Darvin Hull, the young attendant who had defied orders earlier, stepped forward from where he'd been shielding Micah near the rear of the galley. His hands trembled as he carefully cradled the child, the infant's tear-streaked face pressed to his shoulder. The sight rooted Elias even deeper in his purpose. He extended his arms gently, and Darvin handed the baby back with reverence, like returning a crown to its rightful bearer. Elias took his son into his arms. Micah's body curled instinctively into his father's chest. Elias ran a hand over the baby's back, whispering softly, "It's okay, little one. I've got you. I've got you." His voice was ragged but calm, almost too calm for the storm that had just passed. Marvin staggered back, holding his wrist, eyes darting about for allies, but he found none. Captain Rayard Straw stepped forward again, jaw clenched, his presence commanding. The lines in his weathered face were taut with conflicted authority. "Mr. Droll," he said sternly, "you are to be restrained until we land." "Do not resist." Marvin did the opposite. He stepped back and shouted, pointing wildly at Elias. "He assaulted me. You all saw it. This is a setup. They're all in on it." His voice cracked with panic as he spun toward the passengers. "Don't just sit there." He attacked a flight attendant. No one moved. In fact, several passengers leaned away from him, arms folded or clutching their seats. Others simply watched with cold, unforgiving eyes. The man who had once ruled the cabin with cruelty now stood isolated, exposed. Even the ones who had feared him were no longer willing to follow. Reynard turned to the two remaining attendants, both older men who had stayed silent for too long. "Restrain him," the captain ordered. They hesitated, then nodded. One approached from the left, the other from the right. Marvin swore under his breath and tried to backpedal, but the galley wall offered no escape. They reached for his arms. "Don't touch me," he bellowed, twisting and shoving, but he was outnumbered and out of options. The men wrestled him to his knees and secured his wrist behind his back with restraint loops. The passengers watched in silence. No cheers, no applause, just the heavy weight of justice finally falling. Elias didn't speak right away. He stood in the aisle, his face streaked with sweat and his shoulder throbbing, but his grip on Micah never wavered. The child had fallen quiet now, soothed by the steady beat of his father's heart. Around them, the cabin seemed to exhale, the pressure that had built for so long slowly releasing. Elias looked up. His voice was firm, clear, and filled the space with finality. No one uses a uniform to crush a father and child." The cabin fell into reverent silence. The prisoner had become the judge. The wheels screeched against the tarmac as the aircraft jolted to a stop at Orville City Airfield. Emergency lights blinked along the runway, casting red and white pulses into the cabin as the passengers sat frozen in the aftermath of chaos. Moments later, the heavy thud of boots echoed up the jet bridge. The doors hissed open with a hydraulic breath, and a team of uniformed security officers stormed inside. Marvin Droll was the first to react. He stumbled forward with one hand pressed dramatically against his ribs, his other flailing in the air as though warding off an unseen danger. "He attacked me," Marvin cried, his voice trembling with just enough theatrical fear to sound believable. "He tried to take over the cabin. I was just doing my duty." The officers exchanged quick glances. One of them, a tall man with a stern face and a silver badge clipped to his chest, stepped forward. "Which one is the aggressor?" he asked, eyes shifting between the bruised flight attendant and Elias Corrin, who now sat with his child pressed tightly to his chest. Marvin jabbed a finger toward Elias. "Him? That's the man. He endangered the cabin. He assaulted me and threatened crew safety." Elias didn't move. He barely blinked. His body ached from the scuffle. His shoulder throbbed from where the tray had struck, and his wrist stung where the straps had torn skin. But all of that faded compared to the weight of Micah's warmth pressed to his heart. The baby whimpered softly, unaware of the world's judgment unfolding around them. "Is that true?" the officer asked, now facing Elias. Elias looked up, meeting the man's eyes with calm steel. "I was bound to my seat. My son was ripped from me. This man," he nodded at Marvin, slammed him against an armrest. "I fought to protect my child." The silence that followed was fragile, like a glass stretched too thin. Passengers shifted nervously in their seats. For a moment it seemed the tide might turn against Elias, that Marvin's uniform and practiced authority would win out once again. But then a rustle. A man in the third row stood up slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he raised his phone high. The screen flickered to life. "I recorded it," the man said, voice dry but resolute. "All of it." The officer turned. "May I see?" He walked down the aisle, took the phone, and watched. For nearly a full minute, the entire cabin was silent. The only sound, the faint whimpering of Micah in the quiet rumble of the aircraft's idle engines outside. Then another passenger stood up, this time a teenager in a hoodie who had been seated closer to the aisle. "I recorded the moment they tied him up," he said, holding his phone like it was a badge of honor. They didn't ask questions, just tied him down while he begged them to stop. Whispers became murmurs. Murmurs became voices. Passengers rose, some hesitantly, others with visible shame in their eyes. One after another, they confirmed what had happened. That Elias had been targeted, humiliated, restrained. That Marvin had acted not out of concern, but out of something crueler. Marvin's face twisted. His bravado began to crack. "They're lying. They're all lying," he yelled, stepping back as the officers turned their attention toward him. "This is a setup. They're all just scared of him, of what he'll do." "No one's scared of him," one passenger muttered under his breath. "We're scared of what you almost got away with." One of the officers took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Sir, please, turn around and place your hands behind your back." "What?" Marvin's voice cracked. "You're arresting me?" The officer didn't answer with words. He simply repeated the command. Marvin looked around in desperation, searching for someone, anyone to defend him. But the silence was absolute. As the cuffs snapped into place, his shoulders sagged. The performance was over. His voice, once loud and commanding, now whimpered like a broken speaker. "You'll regret this," he hissed. But the threat held no weight. The officers guided him toward the exit, his protest fading with every step. One of the security men turned to Elias. "Sir, on behalf of Orville Air Command and local authorities, we're sorry." Truly, Elias nodded once, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement. "Just make sure it never happens again," he said, tightening his grip on Micah. As the officers moved away, Darvin Hall, the junior flight attendant, hovered at the edge of the aisle. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved since the moment Elias reclaimed his child. Now his face was pale and his eyes glistened with something unspoken. Shame, regret, perhaps even relief. He opened his mouth to say something, then stopped. Elias met his eyes. For a long, waited second. Neither of them spoke. Then Elias gave him a slow, firm nod. Darvin's shoulders slumped as though a mountain had been lifted from them. He nodded back. A quiet promise exchanged in silence. Outside, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles painted the tarmac in streaks of red and white. Inside, the storm had finally begun to settle. Elias looked down at Micah, whose eyes were closed now. Tiny fists curled near his chest. He kissed the child's forehead and whispered something only Micah could hear. Justice had found its wings midair and landed with them. The footage went live before the plane's wheels even touched the tarmac at Orville City Airfield. Clips of Marvin slamming baby Micah against the armrest, Elias bound to his seat and screaming, and the chaos erupting midair flooded social media feeds like a tidal wave. Within hours, the story became the top headline across every major news outlet. Brighthaven CEO restrained while infant attacked on plane. One banner read in stark red text. Another blared, "Father's fury at 30,000 Fturi, a cabin became a cage." The videos, though shaky, captured everything, enough to ignite public outrage and force the nation to pay attention. Elias Corrin didn't sleep that night. He sat in the hospital's private observation room, watching over Micah as the baby slept peacefully, unaware of the storm still raging outside. His wrists were bandaged, his shoulders sore, and his suit torn in 3 places. But none of that mattered. He wasn't a CEO anymore. Not in this moment. He was just a father, one who had nearly lost everything in a place that promised safety. His phone buzzed every few seconds. Calls from reporters, lawyers, board members, even government officials. Some offered support, others warned him to manage the narrative. Elias let most of them go unanswered. Only one call mattered, the one from his own conscience. By morning, he stood on the steps of a press hall in downtown Orville. Suit freshly pressed, but his expression grave. Dozens of microphones pointed toward him like weapons. Flashes burst across the stage, each one freezing his solemn face in time. Behind him, a massive digital screen played a looping reel of the flight incident, paused on the moment Marvin raised Micah into the air with cruel intent. "I didn't come here to recount trauma," Elias began, voice firm yet steady. "I came here to ensure it never happens again." He gripped the podium, his knuckles white. The room fell completely silent. "This wasn't just one man losing control," he continued. "This was a system that allowed it, a culture that tolerated it, and a silence that fed it." Reporters scribbled furiously. One camera zoomed in, catching the faint bruise near Elias's temple. "I'm launching an initiative today," he said, It's called the Micah Promise. Its mission is simple: to protect children, parents, and families from abuse and travel. Whether on planes, trains, or terminals, no one should fear cruelty at the hands of those meant to serve. His voice trembled just slightly when he added, especially not fathers doing everything they can to keep their babies safe. Across the room, eyes welled up. One reporter, a young man barely out of journalism school, lowered his pen and simply listened, stunned by the raw humanity pouring from the stage. That afternoon, Darvin Holt stood beside Elias for the first time publicly. His uniform was crisp, but his hands trembled slightly as the cameras turned toward him. He looked smaller without the shadow of the cabin behind him, yet his voice didn't waver. "I failed to act soon enough," Darren admitted, looking directly at the cameras. "But when I finally did, it was because I saw something no job could let me ignore. A child in danger and a man screaming for help." He paused, swallowing hard. "Marvin Droll doesn't represent us, and I won't be silent anymore." The room erupted into spontaneous applause. Elias didn't smile, but he stepped closer, offering a single solid handshake. It wasn't for show. It was a gesture of respect earned, not given. The airline's response came swiftly but clumsily. Luter Airlines released a statement expressing deep regret for the unfortunate events, but stopped short of accepting responsibility. Public backlash was immediate. Their stock dipped. Their CEO went into hiding. Within 48 hours, half the flight crew from that night was placed under investigation or suspended. The pressure was mounting. And for once, the walls were closing in on the powerful, not the powerless. Elias didn't stop. He spoke at forums, appeared on news panels, and sat across from government regulators demanding stricter training standards, psychological screening, and clearer accountability mechanisms for in-flight staff. At each stop, he carried a framed still from the flight, a blurry but unmistakable image of Marvin gripping Micah mid-scream. "This isn't about revenge," Elias would say. "This is about responsibility." Back in his office at Brighthaven Technologies, his board tried to shield him, urging him to refocus on the company's core. Elias refused. He redirected part of the firm's quarterly budget to fund the Micah Promise. He hosted listening sessions with other families who'd endured quiet abuse while traveling. What had started as a nightmare at 30,000 FT was now the foundation of a movement. The final press conference came 2 weeks later. The room was packed tighter than ever. International press, lawmakers, tech industry giants. Elias stood tall behind the podium, holding Micah gently in one arm. The baby, dressed in a soft blue onesie, yawned and snuggled into his father's chest, unaware of the dozens of cameras pointed at him. Elias glanced down at his son, then looked straight ahead. "You will never remember what happened up there, but the world will never forget." From broken straps rose unbreakable resolve. 2 minutes later, he broke free, and the same cabin that echoed with his child's cries shook with his fury. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It exposes themes of racism, abuse of authority, and the deep trauma caused by violence against families. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke thought about injustice, and inspire empathy, accountability, and the pursuit of a more humane and equitable society.